Well, at least they picked another Swedish actor to play Father Merrin. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. As part of my Exorcist review series, today I'm going to be talking about the fourth film in the Exorcist franchise, 2004's supernatural horror prequel, Exorcist: The Beginning. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content, like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Exorcist: The Beginning stars Stellan Skarsgård, Izabella Scorupco, and James D'Arcy, and was directed by Renny Harlin. Set in 1949, it tells the story of Father Merrin, who, after suffering a crisis of faith, encounters a demon while excavating a church on an archaeological dig. Although The Exorcist is rightly regarded as a classic, the film franchise it spawned has been subpar, even by horror franchise standards. Stories, styles, and even connections to one another have varied wildly throughout this franchise's chaotic run, but one thing the sequels and prequels have shared is their penchant for production issues. You'd think it'd be tough to top Exorcist 2's script troubles, or The Exorcist 3's decade-long delay in third-act reshoots, but this prequel managed to pull it off. Or should I say pair of prequels. You see, Exorcist: The Beginning has a sister film of sorts. Paul Schrader originally filmed an Exorcist prequel in 2003, but after several rejected cuts of the movie, the studio then tapped Renny Harlin to oversee script revisions, and then reshoot everything. That revised, reshot film is what we have here with Exorcist: The Beginning. But after the film's poor reception, the studio decided to release Paul Schrader's already completed version of essentially the same movie the following year, as Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. So I know a lot of people are frustrated by the prevalence of franchises in modern cinema. Sequels, prequels, remakes, reboots, a decent chunk of films are some sort of reworking of an existing IP. And when that existing IP is something as influential and iconic as The Exorcist, people can get even more protective of the original material. So I'm sure that there were, and still are, a lot of people who scoff at the idea of an Exorcist prequel. It's not a movie that needed a prequel, but I do think that it was a story that had some interesting prequel potential. Father Merrin was a bit of a mysterious character in the first film. We got glimpses of his archaeological work and hints at his history and past interactions with Pazuzu, but the actual connection there was never clear in the film. This prequel does touch on those things. Merrin's essentially a priestly Indiana Jones here, and there's a lot of unnamed Pazuzu lore, but somehow the focus drifts away from the initially thoughtful exploration of these concepts. Instead of keying in on Merrin and Pazuzu as setup for the events of The Exorcist, this film degrades into a jumbled, increasingly random assemblage of ideas. It's more cohesive and coherent than Exorcist 2 at least, but it's still muddled. The film actually starts off decently, with an interesting mystery and some Merrin character work, but then it starts to drag. I'm all for slow burns. I mean, the original Exorcist is a slow burn until that third act, but this film struggles with differentiating between slow burn and boring. It does eventually recognize its own pacing issues, but then the randomness ensues. Colonialism drama, battle sequences, chase scenes, dozens of jump scares, but the thing that seems to get thrown in the most at this point is gore. The Exorcist Believer may change things in October, but as of right now, Exorcist: The Beginning is the goriest film in the franchise. It's got a lot of blood and entrails, but it's also just one of those gross-out horror movies. Pus, flies, rotting things, lots of maggots. It doesn't offer much in terms of scares, but it does try to shock the audience with nasty imagery. It devolves into an unpleasant and grimy film, but much like the story, the visuals of Exorcist: The Beginning start off decently. In addition to the archaeological search for religious artifacts, a distinctly Indiana Jones vibe also comes into play with the aesthetics early on. It's sleek and unmistakably a 2000s movie, but it does a decent job with production design, costumes, and period feel. Unfortunately, as the story devolves, so do the visuals. Practical elements get pushed aside in favor of CG elements, and they're not great. I saw this movie in theaters, and remember the effects being iffy even then, so they have certainly not aged well. The bizarre amount of hyenas, the wall crawling, the fly swarms, the ridiculous looking final confrontation, it all definitely makes you nostalgic for the practical effects of the first film. Exorcist: The Beginning isn't a terrible movie. It's not even the worst in the franchise, but it's also far from a good movie. Considering the franchise's history, it probably isn't surprising that a prequel released 31 years after the original film isn't very good, but the product is still disappointing, given the prequel potential of the story. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number 1 has got to be the first act. The movie opens a little cheesy, but once Father Merrin's story kicks in, things are actually decent for a while. It's certainly a bit different from the original film, but the pulpy adventure style and archaeological mystery are pretty interesting. This first act hints at some character development, and it looks alright with its sleek rendition of the period setting. If the film had been able to maintain these things throughout its runtime, it probably would have been okay, but unfortunately, that's not the case. On the con side, the biggest issue is the focus, which after the first act appears to be non-existent. The prospect of a prequel story focusing on Father Merrin and his history with Pazuzu was a promising one, but this movie often strays from that idea in order to give us an action-filled but very slow, jump-scare-filled shockfest. The story's focus jumps around and offers up an abundance of random plot beats before eventually making its way back to the Merrin-Pazuzu core, but fumbling with the execution. Con number 2 is the CGI. Visual effects problems can often be the result of outdated technology and a film's age, but having seen this one in theaters, I can tell you most of these visual effects were underwhelming by 2004 standards too. The final climactic confrontation scene is awful looking, but the rest is just subpar. Following in Exorcist 2's locust footsteps, this prequel brings in its own weirdly overused animal, the hyena. Most of the hyena scenes are shrouded in darkness to cover up the CG, but that only helps so much. The third con is the pacing. The first act sets this film up as an adventure-tinged slow burn. There's a lot of exposition, but once that's out of the way, the story settles into a slow, atmospheric pace. But at some point early on in the second act, that slow burn turns into a boring smolder. And that's when things take a turn for the worse. Almost as if overcompensating for the drawn-out dullness, the film is injected with periodic moments of frenetic action and jump scares. These scenes do help to jolt you awake again for a while, but their randomness within the overarching story does more harm than good. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Exorcist: The Beginning or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Exorcist: The Beginning 2 out of 5 paws. Although a prequel to The Exorcist had some potential, this first released but second filmed version is unevenly paced and focuses on the wrong aspects of the story. Prioritizing gross-out gore over horror, it's a disappointing and jumbled extended reshoot of a film. I would recommend Exorcist: The Beginning to Exorcist franchise completionists or people who really like mid-2000s gross-out horror. This never reaches Eli Roth levels of cringe-inducing gore, but it's definitely got that identifiable, mediocre 2000s horror vibe to it. So if you're feeling nostalgic for that type of movie, you might get some enjoyment out of the second half of this one. Unfortunately, I would otherwise only recommend this to people looking to watch the Exorcist franchise in its entirety. A prequel focusing on Father Merrin might sound interesting, but this film largely squanders the idea. If you liked Exorcist: The Beginning, I would recommend Dominion prequel to The Exorcist. The backstory and production drama behind why there are 2 Exorcist prequels is fascinating, but if you like the story and want a somehow different version of the same thing, also starring Stellan Skarsgård, you'll want to watch this first filmed but second released Paul Schrader film. If you'd like another mid-2000s horror franchise release, you should check out the 2006 remake of The Omen. Arguably as unnecessary as this Exorcist prequel, The Omen retells the familiar story of religious-tinged evil with that identifiable 2000s style. And if you want a horror prequel that's actually good, you should check out Annabelle Creation. The 4th film in the Conjuring franchise, and the 2nd Annabelle movie, it delivers chills while providing us with the Annabelle doll backstory that we had hoped for from the first film. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Exorcist: The Beginning? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite horror prequel? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies. The way life should be.